And I'm going to give our panelists, our amazing panelists, about 90 seconds to intro themselves. And panelists, the questions that I have for you, and I'll put in the chat as well, is what do you do, why do you do it, and what do you hope to teach our community today? Does one of you want to start us off?
Do you want to just go left to right?
Let's do it. Go for it.
All
Jenny.
right. So I'm Jenny Dearborn, and I am based in Boston, sitting outside right now. And I am the Chief People Officer at Klaviyo, which is an internet marketing startup. And I have been Chief Learning Officer, Chief Talent Officer, and been in sales and HR executive roles for about 20 years. I hope to bring wisdom and hard-won experiences through trial and error and mistakes along the way through a long career, and hoping to bring insights to the folks in the on the call today, and looking forward to the conversation with my peers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. Appreciate it. Malcolm, why don't you go for it?
Sure. Thanks, Sam. And thank you, everyone, the 51 plus participants who are on the call today. It's really exciting to have this conversation with you. My name is Malcolm Glenn, and I live in Washington, D.C., and I wear a couple of hats. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at a company called Better.com, which is one of the leading digital platforms to help people find, purchase, insure, and close on a home. In fact, we were actually just named the #1 startup by LinkedIn just a few weeks ago, and our goal, similar to making something more accessible like home, is to make home ownership more accessible for people across the country. I wear a few other hats. I'm a fellow for New America and a senior fellow for the Center for Workforce Inclusion. And I do this work because I just really love cities and local communities. And everything I do ties back to this notion of creating the most equitable local communities for people from underserved communities. I formerly led policy and communication strategies around all of these issues at a couple of big companies, specifically Google and Uber. And I've realized through that work that none of these issues, whether it's transportation or work or housing, exist in a vacuum. And they're all related to how we envision making cities thrive, particularly in ways that will make the private sector help push cities to be more equitable. And my goal today is to help you all come away with some concrete strategies as to how to stay engaged, to give your employees the space they need to have these conversations, but in a way that won't have them piss each other off.
I love it. Thanks, Malcolm. Alyssa, how about you?
Great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Alyssa Cohn. I'm an executive coach. I work a lot with startups. Prior to that, I was the CFO of a startup, and I was the head strategy of another startup, and also I'm a former consultant. So I would say the other things that I do now is I write for Harvard Business Review and Inc. and Forbes, and I also do guest lecturing at Harvard and Cornell and the Naval War College, and I'm also part of the runway program at Cornell Tech, which helps startups, postdocs specifically, commercialize their research. So, you know, all of that being said, I got into coaching 20 years ago because I had this voice in my head, this music in my head that said to make a difference. So what I care about every day is making a difference. I think that startups are a great place to make a difference. And I want to make a difference with you all today, for you and with all you today, because I truly believe that we cannot resolve any issue if we can't talk about it. So the idea of having safe space and a structure and context and tools to talk about hard things, because only through talking about hard things that we will be able to resolve them and come to a shared understanding.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Alyssa. And Brian, take us home.
Yeah, so good afternoon or morning, evening, everyone. My name is Brian Emerson, and I live outside of Washington, D.C., not too far from Malcolm. And I have been doing organizational development and consulting work for about 25 years, and work primarily right now in the areas of culture and strategy alignment and leadership development, and also do some executive coaching as well. My primary area of focus is paradox and polarities, and so helping people navigate two seemingly opposite states at once, so candor and diplomacy. And I teach about polarities and paradox at Notre Dame and Georgetown University of Maryland, and recently started a new business that has launched a number of assessments helping leaders to ascertain how well they're navigating certain tensions inside of their life. And so that's really sort of my niche. But why I do it, I think people in the world need to be having different conversations. I think different conversations with themselves, different conversations with their partners, with their colleagues. And I think that if we don't have different conversations, the energy in the systems gets stuck. And if that happens, systems are in trouble. And so that's really why I do what I do, ultimately to help increase the consciousness on the planet and people's capacity to be able to love. So, and what is it that I hope to teach today? I think what I would echo what all the other esteemed colleagues have said. And I would say that I also hope to teach that we actually need to show up more wanting to learn. So I think that that's probably, I'm here to learn as much as teach today. So that's, I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Cool. Thank you, Brian. And for those of you who are new to Hone and haven't seen my face before, I'm Sam. I run Hone's Learning Experience. I'm also a coach and have a master's in clinical psychology. And similar to some of what Brian just said, I'm fascinated by the polarities of leadership, which we'll talk a little bit about today as well. So let us jump on in. Here's what we'll focus on. How do leaders honor freedom of speech and uphold values like civility and mutual respect? When political conflict does arise, as a number of you have put in the chat, how do we transform conflict into deeper understanding, dare I say compassion and more consciousness perhaps? And then what next steps will you take to navigate political conversations effectively at work? And as we do with every Hone class, we will end with your commitments. So let's jump in. Before we get to this question, I just want to read off a few statistics that I thought were fascinating. So 64% of people today, and this was some polling done actually a few months ago, say political discussion at work has grown more heated over the past 5 years. 72% of people feel stressed or anxious when heated arguments occur. And this one's my favorite one. 67% of millennials say they quit their job over political differences with their boss. And so all those statistics to frame this question: how do leaders thoughtfully embrace political conversations in the modern workplace? And why don't we start, Alyssa, why don't you start us off and then we'll jump around.
Sure, Sam. So this is like the largest question there is, right? In terms of how do we thoughtfully embrace these conversations? And I think from my point of view, what I've been working with my leaders to do is to recognize that they're a reality right now. You have to find ways to give people time and space. So the embracing is exactly right. We have to give people time and space, and then also tools to deal with it. So what that really means is encouraging people to not use judgmental language, but to use fact-based language, and also to set aside specific kinds of time where we can have those conversations and other time where we're not having those conversations. Those are my first sort of steps on that.
Love that. Who else wants to jump in?
Just jump in and say, Sam, I think what you touched on around the likelihood that folks have of leaving their company because of a disagreement with their boss is really apt. If you just look at the case in point that has taken place over the last couple of weeks with the company Coinbase, you may have seen that they recently announced that they were going to be not engaging in allowing employees to take political stances or taking political stances themselves. And as a result of that, I think something like 5% of their workforce decided to actually take a severance package and leave. And I think Alyssa's point is exactly right. You can't shy away from these conversations. You have to proactively sort of embrace them and take them on. Companies are inherently risk averse in a whole host of issues. And I think the reality is there has to be an active rejection of that risk aversion in order to recognize that you can't bury your head in the sand. You, in fact, have to embrace this. And if you do create the space, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the creation of that space looks like, you're going to have employees that even in points of disagreement are a lot more comfortable and appreciative of working at the company where they are.
Brian, did you want to jump in there?
I'd love to jump in and
Please.
say that we have seen a tremendous trend in leaders at corporations feeling more comfortable getting engaged in political statement. It used to be the case 20 years ago that nobody ever spoke about politics, same as religion. You didn't talk about it, you didn't ask about it, you didn't get engaged, you didn't make campaign contributions on behalf of the corporation. It was just verboten. And we don't see that now. So, the best, most successful, most admired leaders, I'm thinking Tim Cook, they make a statement. They come out and say how they feel. And that is a significant talent retention tool for those young people. And I think leaders in organizations need to recognize that. And you need to think about, who are my customers, and also what is my talent that I'm trying to attract and retain today. And young people who live in cities are politically active, and they want to work for a company that has a strong sense of purpose and makes a stand. So I think that business leaders need to recognize the change in the workforce, and the change in trend of, it's okay to talk about these things, but creating a safe place to do so.
Yeah, I love that, Jenny. And just a follow up on this, and would love to hear from the panel. Well, how do you decide then what type of statement to make? And is it just something that needs to deeply align to your culture, or is this something that needs to be deeply felt as a leader? How do you figure out what kind of statement do you make?
Well, I think it's for me, I think, I don't know if you saw, but Bob Feldman had an article in HBR earlier this month, and it said that one of the things in there that blew me away was that the workplace is one of the last places where, on a regular basis, the vast majority of Americans are interacting with people who might have a different viewpoint than they do.
Yeah.
Right. And when you think about how crucial that is to democracy, right, for different viewpoints to have a voice, creating, and so this whole idea of making a statement on one hand and allowing space inside of an organization for different differing viewpoints is really important, right? And so it's a tension that's got to be navigated.
If I can, that's a great point. I'd love to add on to that and say the muscles that we learn to navigate through difficult conversations about politics in the workplace are the same muscles that we need to exercise when we talk about, what is the product roadmap, and what marketing campaign should we go after, and do we have channel conflict in our sales approach, and whatever it is that you're talking about, you need to be able to engage in conversation where you're going to have lots of different opinions, and you should come to that conversation with deep respect, empathy, understanding, curiosity, to really understand different points of view, because your company's product, the success of your company might be on the line. Should we go all in on that path for the product development, or this other path? Like, it's critical that we get this right. And we have to exercise these muscles of deeply listening with curiosity, respectful communication, non-defensive communication. These are the same muscles that we need when we talk about, other things that are very charged, like politics.
Absolutely. Anything to add from any of you on this? I guess one of the, I'll present that a little bit more. One of the things that I find fascinating, that's perhaps different from a product roadmap sometimes, is what are the facts, right, when it comes to politics? And I mean, we've seen, false information or fake fact, all of this in culture now. I'm curious, how does that shift the way that you create policies or procedures around how to navigate political conversations at work? It's like, those aren't the facts, right? We're not actually looking at the same thing. How do you advise that leaders and others think about that?
Well, I think one of the ways you do that, Sam, is you can't think about these things only when there's an outcry or there's a controversy. You need to be thinking about these things well before that. And while there are different ways in which people can interpret different information, there are some foundational points that you can map your response to based on what your values are. And I think that foundational question, what are your values, is really, really important. And no company should ever think about engaging in these types of conversations, putting out statements, determining what's truth and not truth, unless they've already established what their values are. And so if you know what your values are, if your values are about inclusion or treating people with respect, or, in my book, a very important value is equitable communities based on the product or the platform that you're creating, you really just sort of cross-reference it with your values. Is this aligned with our values? And it might be a little bit unclear what someone whether someone is saying something that's true or not. But I think for better or for worse, one of the really good realities of the situation we're in today from a political perspective is the lines are drawn. And so you might say, oh, it's a little bit unclear what someone is saying or someone's not saying, or whether this source is the right source or this source isn't the right source. But I think it's pretty clear, who is saying what, and whether that is aligned with values and whether that is not aligned with values. And so I think before you can even engage in this conversation, before you can even have a conversation within your leadership team around what you say, how you parse what's real or not, you have to say, what are our values? And if you know the answer to that question kind of at your core, then I think the answers that will follow will be a whole lot easier.
Yeah, Malcolm, I really appreciate your point. And I would add, it's like, I think for many companies, there's been a little bit of like, oh, that's, some of that soft stuff, not that important. Some of that's, like the vision thing and the culture thing and the values thing. Yeah. And I think this year, if nothing else, it has brought to light the need to engage in those conversations and to really clarify, like Michael was just saying, clarify values, clarify where we stand. And then I guess from my point of view, really drive the need for the kinds of training, education, and culture creation around how to have, for example, in this case, candid conversations, which are also respectful. And teaching that and building that muscle it's like right now, that's where companies can kind of like rise or fall on, do we have that skill or not?
Yeah, and I think
thank you.
The piece on values is so important from the organizational standpoint. But I think that when we're talking to other people, it's about really trying to be able to validate what their values are. Malcolm's point about like the lines are drawn. One of my tips for leaders is like, give up the second you go into a political conversation, you've got to give up on convincing. Right? Go to curiosity and give up on convincing. In today's political, assume you will convince the other person of nothing, and be curious of wanting to learn about them, right? And so what is there to learn? And then to really just to that values point, to validate their values, which is underneath the facts. Like, I don't care if you have the facts right or wrong about gun control, right? But what I can do is, when I'm listening to you, I can respond by saying, oh, so it sounds like you don't want people to tell you what to do. It sounds like being able to determine what you do is really important to you, right? The person feels heard, you've gotten below the facts. But if you go in trying to convince them, because when we can get to the value level, we can usually find some sort of agreement. But it's the facts, to your point, Sam. You'll never agree on the facts in today's day and age.
Yes.
The values.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
If I could say one other thing about values, I think that in my experience, corporations put on paper what their values are, but it's possible that the company is not totally aligned on those values. Those are the values that are aspirational. These are the things that we want to say we value, but is that really the norms of how communication happens? Is that in practice, in reality, what people actually value, in conference rooms and in everyday decisions, and how, people are promoted, or whatever it is. Because if you have a value statement and then you build political discourse on top of that, but that value statement is not universally held, then I think you're in a really dangerous territory.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Jenny. It's like the litmus test of whether or not you're really living into your values. I can't think of a better one than having political conversations at work. It's like, do we really care about, do we really value mutual respect? Let's put it to the test. And so I guess to ask a tactical question leading off of what some of you have said, and I don't know that it's so prescriptive, but I'd love to hear your thoughts for those who have joined the call today. How does this lean into, well, can I have a Biden or Trump sticker on my desk? Or can I raise my political affiliation in a conversation on Zoom with 5 colleagues? How do we navigate that? Again, at a high level, it's attached to values, but how does that trickle down into the day-to-day political movements that folks in our organizations make? What are your thoughts on that?
I love this question, and I have tons of thoughts, and I actually think you need to tie it to your business. So I'll just do a little bit of a compare and contrast. I remember in 2016, the day after Donald Trump was elected, it was probably the hardest day I've ever had going into work. And I went into work and I cried openly. The only time I've ever cried at work. And there was one other person, and it just so happened that it was one of the few other Black women who worked in my office who came over and gave me a hug. And I remember thinking, we have values on paper, but it doesn't feel like we're given the sort of space to be our full selves in the processing of and the engagement with, what's going on in the world, what was going on in the world in that case 4 years ago. And so I think that was not necessarily an indictment of where I was then. I think it's just the reality of the evolution of how companies are recognizing this. So you fast forward to now at Better, where I work today, we've tried to address some of these issues much more aggressively and actually proactively give people the opportunity to state what they believe. And I think the best way to do that is not to say, are you pro-Trump or are you pro-Biden? But it's to tie it actually back to what you're doing there from a work perspective. And so we have not situated our political conversations necessarily on who do you want to vote for, but we've situated them back to what we do as a company, which is help people get access to home ownership. And there is a whole history of racist efforts, discrimination, redlining, predatory lending practices in our space. And so we've said, let's not just have a generic political conversation, but let's actually have a very salient political conversation related to what our business is. And so we actually started something that we call a racial equity book series. And what that does is it gives employees a very explicit company-wide sanctioned space. We started with this book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, which talks about housing segregation and redlining. And what we do is we've actually given employees the space, an hour a week, to talk about whatever they want related to that. And we have offices in red states and we have offices in blue states. And so there are very, very contentious conversations that take place in the course of those book clubs. I was in one last week and I remember someone after the book club saying, I've never been in a work context where I have been sanctioned to have this conversation. It will probably reflect positively on me when I ultimately have my performance review. Next month, actually, we're going to bring in Dr. Rothstein to have a company-wide conversation where we dig deeper into those issues. So I think the way you do it is not say, hey, wear your blue stripe or wear your red stripe, but we actually say, let's talk about what you believe. And it's okay if we disagree. In fact, we encourage that, but let's tie it back to our business. So you don't come away saying that guy who likes Trump or that guy who likes Biden is wrong, but you say, oh, this helps inform how we deal with customers, whether we're showing empathy when we're talking to a person who might be going through the mortgage process for the first time. I think it's really important to not just say, let's talk politics, but say, let's talk politics in a way that ties back to what we should all be here doing. And if, of course, someone feels like that's not aligned with the broader mission of the organization, then perhaps that's not the space for that person to be working.
Thanks, Malcolm. Other thoughts building off of what Malcolm just shared? Some really beautiful examples there. Thank you.
I guess, Malcolm, I maybe have a question for you. So I thought that was very interesting and like very helpful. And also that's kind of that, if I can say so, there's a formality to that, like the work sanctions that. In my experience, the CEOs that I work with are also dealing with people are having, informal conversations, unsanctioned conversations, and they can sometimes get contentious. And then also there's a whole question someone asked us in the chat earlier about social media. And I think that's been very difficult to tread. And I can just share some thoughts, but Malcolm, I'd love to really hear back from you also, like what we've been trying to do and what the CEOs I'm working with trying to do along with their HR folks is really to distinguish sort of free speech from hate speech. And that's really where to draw the line. Now, is there a solid line? Can't necessarily say, because that can also be subjective, although there is a sense of err on the side of free speech. And what I mean by that is don't put yourself in the position that someone's going to ask if that was hate speech, right? Make sure that you employees are on the right side of that. And if you're on the right side of that, then, sort of those conversations can happen. But Sam, do you mind my asking Malcolm,
Please.
like, have you guys sort of dealt with that?
It's such a great set of questions. And I think what we've seen is that sometimes giving that sanctioned space actually gives people the outlet they need such that they're not as predisposed to get into the fights or the contentious arguments or the slack back and forth. And so we don't say, just because you're having this opportunity to talk about housing discrimination in a company sanctioned way, that means you don't get to talk about politics. But what we think it will do and what we've started to see it do is I think the reality is people kind of come to work with burdens and tension and pain from the outside world. I think anyone who has been coming to work as a Black person the last couple of months has really felt that. There is a trauma that makes just doing your job, whatever your job is, challenging. And so it's not necessarily related to, I need to talk about why I don't like Trump. It's I need an outlet to really feel like I'm heard, I have space to talk, and I'm talking with people who, to Brian's point, don't necessarily need to be convinced, but are going to at least be thoughtful about what I have to say. And so what we've seen is we haven't gone particularly prescriptive in saying, don't have these other conversations, or, there is a specific line around which we are going to determine you have crossed when it comes to things like hate speech. It's a little bit like the Supreme Court in pornography. You kind of know it when you see it, right? But what we have seen is when people have an outlet, the other conversations are calmer. And so we have seen fewer issues on Slack. We've seen fewer people kind of coming to HR with complaints, with issues, sort of raising their voice. Now, that's not necessarily going to be sustainable, but at least in the short term, providing that sanctioned space specific to our company has meant less of the other issues that we were certainly worried about, and I think we'll continue to be worried about over the course of the next couple of weeks. But it remains to be seen whether that is the right strategy, but we've certainly been feeling pretty optimistic about what's happened over the last couple of months.
Since you got to ask Malcolm a question, can I ask Malcolm a question? I would love some.
Yes, Jenny,
I'd love some advice. Thank you. I'd love some advice on what do you do when you have a company who seems to be or is very politically aligned and strongly aligned, and a majority of the folks at that company lean a certain way, and whether they're vocally saying it or not, it's sort of known at the company. And then what if you're in that minority of people that feel a different way? How do you, I'm just thinking back, your comment triggered it when you said, for me, you came to work, in 2016 and you had a very strong emotional reaction. And I remember in the news at the time, companies putting out very strong statements saying this outcome is a horrible thing, and we really want to align with how our employees feel, and we're there with you. And this is, I'm using hyperbolic language, but they made it very clear that the company felt great empathy towards the majority of their employees that felt like this was a bad decision that the country made. And then a small group of the employees at that company said, I don't feel like it's safe for me as a go Trump person to come to work. Like when everyone around me is sobbing, I'm like, quietly going, yay, you know, I don't feel like it's safe for me. Of course, I'm using exaggerated language to make a point, but how do you navigate that as an HR person that's trying to create a safe place for everyone, where you really want to honor this very strong reaction that probably a lot of people are having, and it feels like the majority, but then, you know, honor the feelings of other people who feel like they're not safe now.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
I love that question. I just want to add one little thing to it, and then would love to hear Alyssa, Brian, and Malcolm addressing this. It's a great question. So through the context of the HR professional, I'd love your thoughts on that, but also through the context, because we have a lot of managers on the line. So through the line of I'm a manager or I'm an individual contributor, how do I navigate that in the office?
So I'll be brief because I also want to hear kind of what the rest of the panel has to say, but I will say that distinction is actually really important, Sam. And thank you for your question, Jennifer, is I don't envy the position that HR folks are in around this space. That's just my quite frank and honest opinion, is because I think it will be challenging, and creating an environment that fosters everyone to be their full self is kind of the stated mission of so many HR functions. But how you bear that out in reality, I don't know that you can. Quite frankly, I don't know that you can create a space where legitimately everyone is going to feel entirely comfortable being themselves. And again, this is a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think it really goes back to that question of values. The more aggressively and the earlier along in the process you are being exceptionally forthright about what your values are. We believe in immigrants being the backbone of the workforce in this country, or we believe in full inclusion for the LGBTQ community, or we believe truthfully that Black Lives Matter. I think you have to say that as much and as earnestly as you possibly can, such that, again, when a person gets elected that feels deeply inconsistent with those values, you will just kind of go back to those as the foundational way that you talk about it. Ideally, you're aligning people with values before we get to a point where a president gets elected that people like or don't like, that's particularly contentious. But if we get to that point and there are people in a workforce that feel differently, I think that means a really challenging reckoning with those employees about what those values are, what the consistency with those values are. I think Coinbase kind of did a version of that probably in the opposite direction that I would think. You know, I think they probably didn't mean to lose 5% of their employee base, but maybe they did. I don't know. I don't work there. But maybe they said, we don't want people here who aren't aligned with our values. And they didn't fire those people. They gave them severance packages. So it was almost their way of saying, these are the values. You know, if you're aligned with them, you're probably going to be successful with this company and you're going to help us do really well. But if you're not, then maybe it's mutually disadvantageous for us to continue to have a relationship together. So the HR question is really hard, but I think if you really articulate your values as clearly as possible, then hopefully you can try to mitigate some of those issues before they come up around a particularly significant external situation.
Anything to add, Brian or Alyssa, on Jenny's question?
Go ahead, Alyssa.
Well, I mean, I would just add, I don't envy them either. And also, you know, even the role of the manager. So very often we have a lot of managers on this call, and you might be a less experienced manager, you might be a more experienced manager, but honestly, I don't think anyone's experienced enough to really handle 2020 in all of the ways it's unfolding. Because right now we're talking about this political environment. There was also some social unrest, right? And there's also, you know, a sudden work from home mandate. I mean, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just say that maybe also recognizing that like everyone's a little bit at the end of their rope and at the end of their fuse. But, you know, one thing I would say is that the truth is that on some of these issues, there is not really common ground. I mean, you do have sort of like, I have a set of beliefs like this, and I have a set of beliefs like this. And I think it's like as we've been talking about, we have to recognize the reality of that. We have to embrace the reality of that. We have to give people space to cover it. I guess I also land in, actually, it's also helpful to find common ground around work. Because at the end of the day, I also think that sometimes it's like, it's not actually in the end productive to go on and on about all our points of disagreement. And even to, think, oh, we want to have a place where everybody feels fully able to express any thought that comes into their head, right? I think the other truth is that there are workplaces that tilt in a certain direction, and that you feel safer or less safe, but you still like that workplace. And you still like to see the baby pictures, right? And so, like, let's find out what we can agree on. And I come back to and connect as human beings, and also connect as shared purpose. So shared values that we've been talking about, and also shared purpose. We're trying to get this thing done. We're trying to get this product out the door. We're trying to actually create an equitable world in a certain kind of way. Focusing on that, sometimes I think sort of salves the wound.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't envy HR folks.
Good luck, Jenny.
So,
Thanks a lot, team.
Yeah,
Appreciate
exactly.
it. Thanks a lot. Vote of confidence, team.
We're right behind you. We're right.
But I think it's so important, especially in the larger context of diversity and inclusion, right? It's about diversity of thought, right? Diversity of, of political ideology, right? It's just, those things are important. And how do we continue to create that space? And what both Jennifer and Malcolm were really alluding to is that this isn't going to be over in 20 days. Like 20 days from now, with the elections happening, but this is not over, right? And so it's about how do we continue beyond that, because there will be winners and losers that we're going to have on our teams, and how do we get to that? I think that one of my tips for leaders, to the managers, Sam, that you were talking about, is that if you know that someone's struggling, if you know that you've got someone like Malcolm who's upset, right? Because to be able to simply ask them, so what is the most upsetting thing about this? Like, what's most upsetting for you? Because it's going to get to, or if you've got someone who's, yay, like, what's the most exciting part about this for you? Because then you get to the values, right? It's not about, because when people, and I think Malcolm, it was you who said that, when you can just really make people feel heard, right? It's about, and when we can get to that level, that's when people not only feel heard, but they feel seen, yes, right? And that's what creates a different conversation and dialogue. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point, Brian. And I want to ask one other related question. While I do that, for those on the line, would love to move this into a Q&A after this question. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and get to the majority of them before the hour is up. My question is on something that Jen actually commented.
I didn't get a chance to ask Malcolm a question. Everyone else asked Malcolm a question.
It's true. That's true.
Bring it, Brian. I'm ready.
I like that. That'll be our first question. Then just be from Malcolm. But I want to allude to something that Jen actually put in the chat here. She said, Malcolm, thank you so much for that example about giving an outlet rather than trying to regulate. It's something touching on what Brian just said around giving a space for others to feel seen and heard. Well, how do you create that outlet? If it's not about regulation, how do you create a safe outlet for folks to feel seen and heard? Is it by having, especially remotely, how do you do that? I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts.
I'll just jump in. Like, I appreciate what you said, especially remotely, because so much of us are having a remote experience. So I think part of it is the way you, the manager, kind of act, right? So you, the manager, are the ones who are leading the way. And so it's, these topics were already covered, but we can't say enough. Curiosity, respect, bringing people out and showcasing that we can, I guess I'll quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, disagree without being disagreeable. If you can role model that behavior, that brings you down the path in terms of having a glue to tie the team together to be able to have uncomfortable conversations. And, that's the name of the game when it comes to political discussions.
I'll just follow up on something that Alyssa said actually in the previous answer, which I think applies anytime. I think it particularly applies to what you, Alyssa and Sam, both said, when we're working remotely and also in the midst of the madness that is this year, is this to sort of acknowledge that this is the case, acknowledge that things are infinitely more challenging than they've effectively ever been, that everyone is on edge, that everyone is dealing with challenges that are entirely unforeseen, and to just lead with kindness, to lead with the kindness that says, hey, we're having a meeting about XYZ in the context of our role. I know it's been a tough couple of days. I know it's been a tough couple of weeks or months. And I know everyone is stressed in dealing with all of these things. And this is the last thing they want to do. I understand that we do have a job to do, but I understand that, hey, I'm not bringing my A game all the time, and that's okay. And we're going to get through this and things are going to be better. Just leading with that sort of sense of kindness when we feel so disconnected over Zoom, I think can go such a long way.
Yeah, I would say model, right? As a manager or leader, like how do you model? Let go of your certainty, right? I think just to be able to say to people that, yeah, I'm voting, but I know I don't have all the answers. I mean, just to be able to add that opens the doorway to I'm not certain. Like even if you are, like, like just to stay, to be able to say that. And then I think also asking people, being to, Malcolm, to your point, like acknowledging like our country is in a world of hurt right now, right? Like our democracy is in trouble because we can't talk to one another, right? Democracy depends on dialogue. What can we do to make sure that we're in dialogue about what's happening in our country, right? And let people come up with their ground rules. I mean, I think that, our employees, people want to have the conversations and we often don't give them the credit. So, to Malcolm's point, if you can't create the space, maybe they will.
If I can add something to that, it goes back to a previous thought about, exercising the muscle around having open conversations about political topics leads to healthy conversations about other things. Leading with empathy, leading with curiosity is ever more important right now, because there's that great Accenture study that came out that said 40% of CEOs, their number one worry is workplace mental health, leading into the winter. And we've got companies of people that they could rally when this first happened because it was new and we were on adrenaline, and then it kept going on, but that's okay because it was summer. And now we're not going to be back in the office. We collectively as a country are not going back to our office until, probably late spring, summer. And so you've got a very tense environment because 2020 is a dumpster fire. And, and then we're headed into the winter. And so people are going to be isolated and lonely, and they're going to be on Zoom all day, and it's going to be dark when they wake up, and dark when they open their laptop in the morning, and dark when they close their laptop at the end of a day. And, so people are just really on edge. And I think, this election is a great opportunity to lead with kindness, lead with empathy, lead with curiosity. This is another opportunity for us to practice. We're all in this together. We are one, group of people that care very deeply about each other, and we will get through this. And just to be very good to each other, because I'm genuinely worried about workplace mental health for a lot of companies as we head into the winter.
Yeah, great point.
And so I guess
we're setting ourselves up because we've so much, you hear this 2020 has been so bad. And, I think that people are developing this, can't wait for New Year's, and everything's going to be better as soon as we get and that's just not. And so I think, Jennifer, your point is so spot on. People are hitting the wall, in early 2021 saying, I thought 2020 was over, so.
Yeah, that's so true. And I just moved to add, lead with curiosity, lead with kindness, lead with humor. Actually, it turns out that adding a little levity to all these conversations, I have found very helpful. And even, you asked earlier about how do we do this remotely. So we're all on Zoom, and because we're all on Zoom, and I was like, okay, I got to up my virtual presentation game. And so back in April, I talked to an expert in this and it really stuck with me. He said, I always make my slides funny. And I was like, oh yes, I know, like compelling, right? He said, no, funny. People are more open to creativity when they're laughing. Like playfulness and humor helps us all learn. So I think like creating that kind of environment, I took that to heart, and I've seen it with my clients. And I think we all need a little more laughter and maybe music.
It would have been great if a song came on like right now.
It would be
Just to
better.
transition
Sam, let's do that next time.
next time.
Yeah.
Well, while we wait on any other questions to come in, and feel free to leave them in the chat, y'all. I'll ask just one more to follow up on this, and really appreciate the conversation. I guess when you're in these moments that feel tense and feel full of conflict, what are some thoughts that you have on how to diffuse? Alyssa pushed us towards laughter. I'm curious if you have other thoughts on how to navigate in those moments. And I'm remembering a quote from Jim Collins, who organizational consultant, best-selling author from Good to Great, who talks about at the great companies, there's a level of tension that's acceptable, and that people learn how to embrace and navigate that differently. And so I'd be curious, what are some of your thoughts on how to navigate those moments differently than perhaps what the status quo suggests sometimes?
I think the first thing I would just jump in and say, breathe. I mean, right, that so much of these political conversations are linked to our identity, right, at this point. And what we know is that when our identity feels threatened, right, I mean, the amygdala goes off. It's just like being attacked by a tiger, right? And so, and the first thing that you can do is just stop and just to breathe. I mean, that's the first thing.
Yeah, I would say actually Brian's exactly right. There's one value in that a lot of these conversations aren't taking place in person. When you get a Slack message, or you get an email, or some other sort of chat, you have the space to take a second before you respond. And similar to Brian's breathe point, I know my responses are sort of orders of magnitude better when I take a second before I just type back, but my instinct tells me to type back. And I think if we all just take a second before we respond in the defensive manner that we are prone to do as humans, then I think that can diffuse a lot of these situations before they escalate out of control.
And to ask yourself, what's the intent in my response? Right? Like, am I responding to defend? Right? Am I responding to convince? Am I responding to? But and to get really, really clear on. And if you're, and I'm making this up, but if your response isn't to better understand, or to spread kindness, or to whatever, make up your own list, then I would take a time out. Like I would,
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. We have one question from Tom in the chat that I think is a great one. Don't think there's a set answer for this, but Tom asked, should you change anything about what you do outside work to be a credible, balanced leader supporting all employees inside work? I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think?
What comes to my mind, I mean, it's not like you should go out and find another hobby for stress release, although you can do that, right? And build your network. But one thing I would say is that we are very in our own bubble. So we're all in our social media bubble, we're in our friends bubble. I suggest for everybody to seek out people who disagree with them outside of work and understand their point of view. You're not going to convince them. Brian made that point earlier. It was like very powerful. Like, yeah, don't try to convince them. You're not going to convince them, but it's helpful for you to be exposed to other people who are not in your bubble, so that brings you a different perspective. When you go back to work, you can help people better navigate and understand.
Yeah, I second that completely. The more diverse your outside experiences are, the more creative you are, the better you are at problem solving, the more networked you are for talent that you need to go leverage for different projects. I was an executive coach before I came back in-house to be the CHRO of the company where I am right now. And working with executives, if they just would get really stuck, I'm like, dude, you need to go take like helicopter flying lessons, or go learn to play the guitar. Like go, you know, go and take a once a week cooking class at night. You need to completely change your perspective and bring a whole new way of thinking about all sorts of things into your problem solving toolkit to be able to become unstuck in the way you're approaching this now.
I think those are both great points. I will just say, I think those work particularly effectively when you have a work environment where you are welcomed and supported and are given the opportunity to thrive. I think sometimes people do find themselves in more challenging work environments, sometimes where they actually need to look outside of work for that community because they're not getting what they should be getting from their manager, what they should be getting from their executives of their company. So in a sort of optimal work environment, I think what you both said is exactly correct. I do, though, sometimes see situations where your only outlet, your only space where you actually do feel supported and like you can be yourself is outside of work. And you might even sort of disproportionately lean into that effort outside of work because you're not getting it over the course of your workday. So I think that's the goal. That's the outcome that managers and executives should be striving for. But certainly that's always not the case for some employees. And sometimes I think they need to find that respite, particularly saliently outside of their work context.
Well, as we come to the end of our hour together, just wanted to appreciate all of you for the really thoughtful and powerful conversation. So many great ideas, strategies, mindsets, values, talked about a lot of important things today. So hope that our audience, hope that everyone on the call took something meaningful from the conversation today. I want to close with a special opportunity from Hone. As part of our mission, we're offering free enrollment in a number of our classes over the next month, which include topics like building high trust relationships. Really at the core of a lot of what we're talking about today is trust and how to build trust with people who might not think or have the same perspectives as you do. Also, overcoming resistance to change, something that obviously 2020 has been just a rocket ship of change. And then leading compassionate conversations. I've heard compassion, I've heard love, I've heard consciousness being thrown out today. So leading a powerful workshop on that coming up on the 22nd. So if these are things that seem interesting to you, or you want to learn more about mindfulness or energy management, or even parenting during COVID-19, we have classes coming later this month. You can sign up today at honehq.com. Promo code is just Phil Wright. Promo code VOTE. And hope that all of you on the call today will take time to vote in a few weeks. But please check out the offerings that we have at Hone, and really appreciate you all joining today.